Thank you. That is good to know.
All right. How was your spring break? Did you get spring break off for school as well, or just for school for university?
Yeah, the district has a spring break, so we just had it last week. Same thing. It lines up with the school. Yeah, I worked a lot. Yeah, like, do we take spring break? Did you take a spring break?
Well, the only difference for me was that I canceled the scheduled classes
Yeah.
because nobody's going to be there. But other than that, I did not notice any difference, except I was able to go to Las Vegas and get some stained glass supplies, which is
Oh,
good.
nice. That's
I
awesome.
have several windows I'm working on, and I needed to get some more glass, and quick little 2-hour drive both
Um,
ways.
would you like to see a piece that I worked on this summer?
Yeah.
Okay, give me 30 seconds. It's just in the window over here. Hold on. Well, I'm a liar. It's gone. Uh, you know how like we start making art and there's art everywhere in our spaces?
Yes.
I don't know where it is. Anyway, I took a class over the summer on stained glass and we just did some glass cutting and I learned how to kind of do the tessellations and everything. It is awesome.
Where did you do the class?
So the UVU did a 1 week intensive 2D, 3D class for teachers.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Because
it was,
I teach that like at Snow College and
yeah,
stuff in Salt Lake and stuff. I'll teach a class like that, and it is intensive. It is
yeah.
hard,
I
and
mean, even just cutting like you have to, there were a lot of little things I learned, like just from grouting to, what colors I want to put together to keeping it simple versus trying to, at least get what's in my head out. Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, just glass in general is gorgeous, especially when it's, got those different colors and whatnot. I don't know. I fell in love.
well, I was for one of my shows. As we were setting it up, we were noticing that people were wanting to touch things desperately,
Yeah.
and we had a half a dozen signs saying, don't touch the artwork. So I put up new signs that said, don't something like, oh, let's see, how did I phrase it? Oh, glass is a rigid liquid, which means when it breaks, leaving an edge that's only a molecule wide. The good news is it hardly hurts when it cuts, and it heals very quickly with little, if any, scarring. And I
Okay.
just put those signs up everywhere over all the do not touch signs. And suddenly everybody was very respectful of the artwork.
Nice.
So that
That's
was
awesome. Um, I
so.
uh I yeah, I'm a toucher. You would have been like, I would have reached out, and then I would have been like, okay, wait, I'll be respectful, but
Well, reaching out is one thing, but when you set up a display and a little kid, his parents are
oh,
ignoring him, and he puts his arm through the work so it goes
no.
all the way, that's not acceptable.
Um,
And
yeah, I don't I don't know if there's enough of the experience in people's lives these days to know how to behave.
I think there is something to that, and when I'm on campus and I see somebody coming in for a class assignment from humanities or communication or English or whatever,
Hmm.
and they look at the artwork, I feel sorry for them
Yeah.
because they look completely baffled. So I'll walk over and I'll introduce them to. I'll very quickly talk about the 4 steps of artistic critique, and it's fascinating to me because in 5 minutes, just that little awareness of how to look at it and how to apply critical thinking to it,
Mm-hmm.
not in an academic way, but just in a let's enjoy this kind of way. It's
Right.
amazing how much more people get out of the artwork.
Yeah.
They're intimidated, frightened, and scared because they don't know how to talk about it. And then once you have that little vocabulary tweak, suddenly you can approach it with confidence. And it's people can explain or people can clarify why they like something or why they're not responding to it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it completely changes their perspective. And I love that seeing that little window open in somebody's brain so they can start actually enjoying the artwork. That's that's one of the things. I'm an artist first, and I do art history and stuff like that, and contextual critique second, just because I'm bored. But I love that. That's the thing that I enjoy the most. I think helping people to get the vocabulary so they can explain why or why not they like something.
Right.
And it's what's interesting to me is 9 times out of 10 that eliminates the intimidation,
Mm-hmm.
and it opens up the door for somebody to like something which 5 minutes earlier they would have been too frightened of.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife has a lot of friends that are way beyond any of the social circles that I would ever interact with, which is usually homeless guys on street corners. But uh, it's fun visiting with them. Like we went just for a couple minutes at the Electric Theater Company, and I just looked at a couple of the artworks and just talked about them for like 2 or 3 minutes. And the rest of the evening, my wife's friend was saying, well, my friend too, but she was saying that that's amazing. I never thought about it like that. I never realized that. I never thought that you could talk about colors and there was a reason why you felt unsettled or you enjoyed it. I
Right.
never thought that these kinds of lines would elicit these kinds of emotions, but now it makes sense. And you kind of feel a little used because of advertising now. And it was just, but it was just, I wasn't being academic. I wasn't using, my dad would call them the 2-bit, the 50-cent
Yeah.
word.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandpa would said when I was about 8 or 9, Andrew, you never want to use 2 words when 50 will do, will you? Do you?
Right. I'm the same way. Are you talking about over at the Arrowhead Gallery, the one that's next to the Electric Theater?
Yeah, right. Sometimes when they will hold the show open
Yeah.
after the theater performance, and you can go over, and it's just kind of fun to spend a couple minutes
Yeah.
walking around with people that have never interacted with art, other than either as something to do to fill up space in their schedule or
Mm-hmm.
as a potential investment. A lot of people don't think that they are, I don't want to say worthy, but that's almost the right word, that they're
Yeah.
in the place where they can actually enjoy art for what it is.
Sure.
And I don't know, and it's fun to introduce people to the fact that sometimes the art is in evidence of the process rather than the thing
Mm-hmm.
looking finished. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I love that as well. But there
Um,
is some stuff in St. George that really, really irritates me. There are certain sculptures by a sculptor whom I will not name, and I won't even describe them very well so that hopefully nobody will know. But
gotcha.
there are sculptures that you see where there are eye lines of people,
Mm-hmm.
and eye lines are really important. If you're doing figurative work that is meant to be realistic, eye lines are vital.
Yeah.
And if hypothetically the sculptor is not paying attention or just doesn't care enough to see where those eyes go, they don't tie you back into the work. But then conversely, I have a friend who does a lot of sculptures around Utah, monumental works. He
Hmm.
pays a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
And so the eye line of this guy sitting in a park, you'll realize if you pay attention to it that he's looking right at his home.
Hmm.
Or it'll be like he did a monument to an indigenous American
Mm-hmm.
kind of a historical hero, and this guy's eyes are looking right towards where his family home was at the
Mm.
point he died.
Yeah.
And he does stuff like this all the time, and whether or not somebody actually engages with that and understands that, the fact is everybody responds to the fact that whoever made it did it on purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that. Or like when there's a grouping of people and all the kids in the grouping are looking at each other, or looking at their parents in the little group, or whatever. I love that. And a friend of mine, I'll say this one last thing, and then we'll go on with the actual lesson. But one of my teachers was James Christensen, who's
Mm.
a pretty renowned LDS artist. He
Hmm.
also did a lot of the magician paintings for the Time Life book of legends.
No, I love his work. I think
Okay,
it's
you know who he
fantastic.
is.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he was constantly thinking about saying different levels that people can enjoy it. If you come back in 3 years, he wanted you to be able to notice something different, something new, to enjoy it constantly. Where is this guy looking? What is this person doing? Why are they holding their hands this way? Not so that he's not trying to give you secret messages like the Da
No.
Vinci Code. He's just providing an environment that you can continually revisit and enjoy, just like a happy book.
Yeah.
And one of he told me about, he did a lot of work for the LDS temples, a lot of paintings. And there was an up and coming artist that would follow around when he would do his presentations. They'd follow him around and tell the designers, hey, for 15% less, I can do the same thing. Or 20% less, I can do the
Yeah.
same thing. And he said, that's true. And you could always tell.
Yeah.
And there is a painting done by this individual that was in one of the temples that I would see quite a bit. And you could tell because no two arms were on the same figures, were the same length. Nobody was looking at other people in the paintings. The eyes weren't, and the same person, they weren't always going in the same direction. The person just was not paying attention to that.
Mm-hmm.
And what was so much fun is with James Christensen or Robert Marshall, these artists, they would pay attention to that. If they were doing a scene for a temple, a mural, the light would have a consistent source.
Mm-hmm.
The plants would be consistent to the landscape. Just
Mm-hmm.
all these kinds of things that a lot of people don't really care about. And I don't know, I love it when, regardless of what the medium is, when the artist pays attention. I love it. I told one of my favorite architects who works now in Utah County.
Mm.
I told him once, I love rewarding patient observation. And
Mm.
now the mark for him for good design, when he tells people that he works with, is I'd like to reward the patient observer.
Wow.
When you sit in front of something for 3 hours, there should be something that gives you a payoff after 3 hours.
Yeah.
That's,
I a lot of times, so like for example, today I was working on Enlightenment versus Romanticism, and I'm teaching, and I always start with just trying to get the kids some foundational knowledge about the time in that history, just so that they make the connection to the art. And one thing I do when I finally get to the art is we look at the eyes, and we look at the details, and we look at the investment, and what, if you're looking at something, what is the, if there was like a secret crush that the artist had on a part of a body, or on like a part of the landscape, can you tell, like, what did they give the most care to, and what did they, and a lot of times they see that once we get into Romanticism, there's like this, I don't know, more the, well, emotional response, because the emotion was put in, versus, the neoclassical. And I think that there's something really awesome about, like, you can tell when somebody is passionate about the subject, whether they're teaching or creating art, or I don't know, whatever they're doing. And if you don't have that passion, if you're just doing it for the dollar, or if you're just, whatever, it's not going to have that attention to detail that is so translatable to others. Anyway, that's
what
my 2 cents.
and there's a couple things that are going on at that time period. One is the phrase "beauty is in the eye of the beholder" did not
Hmm.
appear in English literature until 1812 when it was first published,
Yeah.
and it is a direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution, where people were starting to realize that they could mass produce art, particularly romantic, starting with romantic, um, for public consumption from the middle income class. You know, all of
Mhm.
a sudden, and so it's interesting to see how uh, focal points shift to celebrate the values that people who have the money to spend um, want to have celebrated.
Mhm.
And you know, I love seeing that. If you have enough money to build buildings for, you know, build a hospital and a school and a library, you're
Mhm.
going to want to have stuff that is monumental for everybody to remember that your contribution. If you have enough money to buy a piano and have a living room big enough for 15 people to come over for a party,
Mhm.
you're going to want to celebrate the fact that you have a piano and a room big enough for 15 people to come over and have a party.
Yeah, probably. I'd hope so.
A little bit different perspective, and I love seeing that shift in perspective where artists finally got to a point where they realized this is a spectrum of humanity that can pay for my work, and I can explore themes that are a little bit closer to my comfort level.
Uh-huh.
And you see that about uh, a little bit over 1,000 years earlier in the Muslim world.
Mhm.
One of the Catholicism, as it was traditionally taught in Europe, really supported the feudal system.
Mhm.
So the idea of a middle income class was looked down on because you had to have land or you had to be a peasant,
Mhm.
and the religion kind of supported that. But Islam in the 7th century supported the idea that you could have income and it was okay for God to bless you with money. And so
Mhm.
suddenly you get, in the first time, I want to say since the height of the Alexandrian dynasty in Egypt,
Mhm.
you get, for the first time, you get a middle income that is actually respectable, and middle class that is actually respectable and supported by the religious structure. And so
Mhm.
you see this massive growth of art that is done specifically to target the middle income class. You
Mhm.
get concrete work that is designed to mimic uh, hand chiseled stone masonry.
Mhm.
You get glass beadwork that is mass, where for the first time since the Romans, glass beads are mass produced.
Mhm.
You know, the Romans felt it were they were as worthwhile as jewels, and the Muslims did too, but they were jewels priced low enough that everybody could have them. You
Mhm.
know, and you get all this fantastic stuff catering towards the middle income class. And the second time that happens, um, you know, and then that kind of general part of the world was during the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, where suddenly you do get a huge
Mhm.
middle income class, and then
Mhm.
and you get like Renoir said, the Impressionism could not have happened without putting paint in tubes. You know,
Mhm.
you get all these supplies, and you get artists that are actually able to afford the supplies to target or to produce material that targets that middle income spectrum of humanity. And I love the fact, I think money is a beautiful thing
Mhm.
because it propels so many people to do so many wonderful things. And I love that. And I'm desperately trying to figure out, oh yeah, okay, this
Mhm.
ties directly into today's subject, this week's subject, because we're dealing with the exact opposite.
Mhm. Pretty much.
Sadly, but that's yeah, I get excited about this kind of thing because art is not. I'll touch on this just briefly, and then I'll wander back to the subject matter. But one of the great consequences of poor education is us being burdened with the false perspective that art is beyond our reach,
Mhm.
and the idea that beauty is transient and only relative to the beholder, because that has never been true. That has
Mhm.
never been true in the history of the world until 1812. Beauty is always something that is understood as a static element of whatever you're looking at.
Mhm.
And the mark of a cultured individual is to be able to see and articulate the beauty that's there.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder is completely impractical, because if that is true, and beauty is another aspect of the idea of truth. If
Mm-hmm.
those things are only a consequence of your ability to be present, and it can only vary, and it can vary with whoever is present, then every dependable element of the structures that we live within start falling apart. You can't depend on anything.
Mm.
Uh, and people have argued with this about this with me before, but I think that the most solid evidence that this argument does have validity is the fact that any book in the world that's translated into more than one language is still going to be a consequential book, whether or not you can speak Dene or French or German or Russian. It doesn't matter. The person who can speak those languages can access that book, and the information is still valid.
Mm.
If everything is a consequence of the relationship to the beholder, books would have no validity, and we could burn them and throw them away if they aren't in the language that we speak.
Right.
And which I think is horrible. Then there'd be no reason for an internet. There'd be no reason for libraries. You know, when I was in Iran, the language for learning was pretty much English. I mean, people all spoke Persian. Most people spoke Arabic as well, but everybody spoke English better than most high school kids here in the U.S. And one of the reasons is that they needed the information in, for example, engineering books or mathematic books or whatever, and all this stuff outside of Iran was published in French or German or English, but you could always find English translations.
Mm.
And so that was the professional language, and that I find that really fascinating. Anyway, sorry for that side. You
No,
put a
you're fine.
quarter in my ear, and I just started going. Okay.
Are we also at some point, did you like don't wait for dark or wait until dark? Anyway, we'll talk about that later. We're talking about regionalism today, right?
Right.
Okay, great.
And the first thing I wanted to share is one of my favorite sketches done by the Monty Python group. And for everybody that gets to this video, about half the time this is edited out of the video for copyright reasons. Sometimes it's not, but it is the first link on your page. So I'm going to share this page really quick.
Cool.
And for everybody who's sensitive, I'm sorry for the language, but this is the link I'm talking about. And we're going to watch it, and you and I are going to talk about it. Everybody else can watch it after this if it is edited out. Okay. So here we go. You ready?
Years ago, that we'd be sitting here drinking Chateau de Chasselas.
I would have been glad of the price of a cup of tea then.
Cup of cold tea. Without milk or sugar. Or tea.
And out of a cracked cup at that.
We never had a cup. We used to drink out of a rolled up newspaper. The best we could manage was to suck on a piece of damp cloth.
That's great.
That's horrible. But what we're talking about is the Great Depression. And it's interesting to me. This is something that is a pretty powerful event that affected almost all the world, almost the entire world. And there are differing perspectives about this, but like, for example, my grandfather, he knew people. He grew up in Sugar House in Utah. He knew people that actually jumped out of buildings because they lost everything. But he himself, he said that the big advantage he had is that he could take his wife and daughter, and they traveled around to find work. And he figured that the entire 10 years of the Depression, he went out without a job for about 6 days, and half of those were traveling.
Wow.
So, and he did, and he said it wasn't ever glamorous work. He did everything from fight fires in Boise to thin peaches, But for most people, it was pretty miserable. I wanted to share this video. I hope this makes it. I'm pretty sure it will.
The Great Depression was a dramatic worldwide economic calamity which started in 1929 and lasted until the late 30s. Most people believe it began with the U.S. stock market collapse of October 1929. By 1932, U.S. stocks were only worth 20% of what they were prior to the crisis, and 1 year later, almost half of all United States banks had failed. By 1935, roughly 750,000 farms had been lost to bankruptcy or distressed sales. European countries, debilitated by the debt they've accumulated due to World War I, dealt with a severe depression and a sovereign debt crisis ultimately emerged. In Germany, for example, unemployment reached 25%, and among other things, this economic disaster led to Hitler's Nazi Party becoming the top political actor after the 1932 elections. Worldwide trade was devastated by the Great Depression, with countries engaging in so-called trade wars by limiting imports. And by the same year, 1932, global trade crashed to half of the pre-crisis volume. Unfortunately, trade wars degenerated into an actual armed conflict, which caused over 60 million deaths. World War II. Make no mistake, most wars have been caused by economic factors to a very large degree. Let's learn from the past and not let this happen again.
Okay, I don't think that's a fair assessment. Wars, and I'll just say this as an anecdotal observation: wars are not caused by economic disadvantage. It's interesting to me because when you look at the history of the world, when there are economic crises, there are two different choices that governments have to make. One is to make friends with the people around them. The other is to attack the people around them. Egypt, during the reign of Hatshepsut, took the route. She guided her country to take the route of making friends with the countries around her, and it became her reign, and then leading into her son's reign, became one of the most prosperous eras of Egyptian history. And then you get the collapse of Rome, which in part happened because they were instigating wars around them. And it's fascinating because at the same time Western Rome was falling because of the wars that they had started around them, Eastern Rome, Constantinople and his family in Turkey, their empire expanded at the same time as the same economic factors because he chose to make trade and make friends with the countries around him. And so, but the reality is the Great Depression, regardless of what happened, was so bad that many governments felt the best way to get out of it was to start a war, which is pretty awful. And what is interesting about this, and I'm going to back off and be a little clinical and less human about it. What is interesting about this is so much of our self-perspective is tied up in self-worth, and so much of our self-worth, we allow that to be defined by how we fit in society, our societal expectations. And what this comes down to is, during the 1930s, a lot of people were losing everything they had, and along with that, their self-identity, their own perspective, because of losing everything that society had been teaching them that they needed to have. And one of the reasons why so many banks failed is people lost faith in them because of all the rampant news about stocks crashing and loss of income through trade wars, that people thought went to panic and withdrew money from banks. Banks cannot operate according to federal law without a certain reserve of cash on hand. And when people withdrew that, banks couldn't operate anymore and had to collapse. And in order to save themselves collapsing, they foreclosed on loans, which people could not pay off. And so they lost their farms. So it's a concatenation of effects that is due to people reacting in fear, beginning with governments reacting in fear. And this is devastating to your self-image and your self-worth. And in response, artists in many areas began a movement where they focused on a celebration, almost like visually, it became almost like a dreamlike celebration of the things that they valued in the areas around them, and in the social areas, in the physical areas, in the homes, in the regions, in the forests, in the skies, whatever it was, in the landscapes, and sometimes even in the stories that help give people identities. And this became the movement called regionalism. And that's what the tie-in. And I have a couple short videos. Let's see, 1, 2, 3 that I want to watch, and they do overlap a little bit, but I think that these are really good, and I want to share them. We'll watch them one at a time. Let's see if yep, this is right. Okay, we'll watch these one at a time, and then talk about it at the end, and then we'll look at some of these regionalist artists. Now, specifically, I'm talking about American regionalism, and this is specifically a reaction to the depression that happened in the United States. There's also regionalism in other parts of the world that come about during very similar events, which is really interesting too. But this is what we're going to work on.
So another purely American movement is going to be American regionalism, or American scene painting as it's sometimes called. And this is a naturalist style of painting and art that was popular in the first half of the 20th century. The artists of the movement will depict scenes of typical American life and landscape, painted in a naturalistic, fairly descriptive style.
Okay, Kelly, before we go on, you were just talking about something that happened about this time in primarily in Europe, and it started impacting the U.S. as well, about 100 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It happened right after the Romantic era. Well, it overlapped quite a bit, but right after the Romantic era. Do you remember what it was? What that movement was called?
You're not talking about transcendentalism, are you?
No, I'm talking about between 1815 and 1860. There was a movement in response to Romanticism called realism.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
And
Yes.
the thing that really marked realism was not necessarily how people depicted human figures and forms so that the visual vocabulary was shared by everybody. It was the very run-of-the-mill, ordinary subject matters. And 100 years later, we're dealing with something very similar in American regionalism. You'll see that a lot of these artists will have different physical styles, but the thing that unites them is these are depictions of stories or narratives that everybody can hold on to, just like the realism of 100 years earlier. And I think that that's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the American resurgence of realism, or American neorealism.
American scene is an umbrella term for the rural American regionalism and the urban and politically oriented social realism. After World War I, many United States artists will reject the modern trends stemming from the Armory Show, in part as a reaction to the war. Oftentimes, when we see war, we will see far more conservative movements following that war, and then things will develop from there. When we get to the next war, we end up with the same thing, a little more conservative, and then redevelopment once again. And we see the same thing around World War I as we do around World War II. So instead, they adopt an academic realism in depicting urban and rural scenes. Much of the American scene painting conveys a nationalism and romanticism of everyday American life. They're trying to create something that reflects the American life of everywhere between LA and New York, oftentimes. And as an anti-modernist style and reaction against the modern European style, this American regionalism was seen as an attempt to define a uniquely American style of art. So as soon as we've seen the Armory Show and Precisionism and Surrealism, and the Americans are starting to get involved in all of these movements, all of these basically modern movements, we see this reaction back. So we're pushing back to a more conservative, more realist movement in this case. And that's not a bad thing. It's just one of these cycles that we see in art history. And it doesn't mean that we can sit there and look at history and go, oh, I can predict what's coming next. That's foolish. There's always a black swan. There's always something that you wouldn't expect at the time. But it does give us a general idea. So if you're looking at a painting, you can kind of start to date it based on realism versus abstraction, American versus European.
Germain struggled for years with dental issues before finally finding.
Sorry about that ad. Didn't mean to see that. Something to keep in mind, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at a lot of stuff that happened after World War I, like the Bauhaus and Surrealism and Dada, which was very much like what we would define and De Stijl as modernist type work, abstraction and stuff like that. And it's interesting that the exact same sets of circumstances that led some people towards embracing Cubism and Surrealism led other people to embracing this kind of regionalist realism, which I think is fascinating. Like Ferdinand the Bull right here, for example. And it's just like I mentioned a couple weeks ago that every war produces songs that are marching songs and other songs that are love songs, where songs that have a very different point to both of them, but they are inspired by the exact same impetus. And we see the same kind of thing with regionalism. So I want to continue on, but we're going to go a couple minutes on definition. And then there's a third one we may not have to watch, but I would like everybody to watch on their own time.
Let's talk about the definition, or how can we define American regionalism? Now, the term itself does not signify an organized movement. Rather, again, like precisionism, we're looking at an aspect of broad tendency for American artists, in this case, to move away from abstraction and the avant-garde between the world wars. Now, keep in mind, there are other movements at the same time between the world wars. They're moving towards abstraction, such as precisionism. But here, they're working against. And oftentimes, we have two different movements at the same time moving in separate directions. It's very common throughout history. Look at the Europeans with realism and romanticism happening at about the same time as one example. Now, these works will stress a couple of different ideas. For example, we will see local small town themes, and that is strictly speaking known as American regionalism. This sort of small town depiction or country depiction. Whereas if we move into the city, we're suddenly going to be looking at social realism, which looks a lot like propaganda in this case, and oftentimes does serve a very similar purpose. So when we see urban scenes within American regionalism, it is known as social realism, following the same basic trends and ideas that we will see with realism out of Europe about 75 years earlier. Now, regionalism is a realist, modern American art movement where an artist shunned the city and rapidly developed technical advances to focus on scenes of rural life. So they're avoiding the technology, they're looking at rural life. Just like precisionism happening at the same time is focusing on technology and ignoring rural life. So again, two sides. The regionalist style was at its height from 1930 to 35, and the best known artists were, of course, the regionalist triumvirate of Grant Wood, who we're going to be looking at, along with Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri and John Stuart Curry in Kansas. Now, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, these artists, the regional artists, will gain wide appreciation for their reassuring images of the American heartland. And much of this appreciation, I should point out, is very populist. It's coming from the people, from away from the sort of bright lights of the art market. So we're not seeing Frank Stieglitz and Gertrude Stein and others that we've been hearing about getting involved here. Instead, this is the average American kind of getting involved. So we have that difference between the people and the avant-garde, and we're seeing that here with precisionism versus American regionalism.
When I started drinking warm water to help.
Well, it's always important to drink warm water. Everybody remember that. Okay, so I want to share this really quick. There are a lot of short videos that I'd like people to look at. Look through until you get an idea of what's going on historically at this time. Of course, the Four Yorkshiremen, I love that sketch, but it's kind of a ridiculous depiction, but it does talk about, it does reference in a humorous way the desperation that many, many, many families felt because of the Great Depression, or as a result of the Great Depression. When we talk about regionalism, we looked at some of these videos, and these articles talk about some of the main artists of regionalists. Norman Rockwell was, a lot of his stuff was a little bit more recent than early 1930s, but regionalism, we're talking about an idea and a rationale for producing artwork, where it's essentially accessible narrative scenes done to celebrate the things that people use to bolster their own identity and self-worth. So, you know, we see the heroic figure in a wheat field. We see people at a church service getting baptized. We see one of the more famous regionalist paintings that we may see a little bit later is George Washington pulling back a curtain with his younger self chopping down a cherry tree, and with the story, you know, I cannot lie, chop down the cherry tree, which I think is kind of an ironic thing because that story itself never happened. So the story promoting George Washington as being honest is in itself most likely a lie. But nothing like a little irony to spice up the world. So look at these different articles and just get a sense for some of the stuff that's going on, and you can see, you know, some of these kinds of depictions of just ordinary life. You know, and we can see Norman Rockwell is very much a regionalist. He has these kind of daily life story images. This is that painting I was telling you about, Parson Weems' Fable. Parson Weem, who was a minister, I believe he was, I think he was Presbyterian, but you know, so he's a minister, was promoting this, made up this story about George Washington never telling a lie, and he chopped down the cherry tree. And of course, this is highly plausible because the baby George Washington has his full-grown man wig there. But what's fascinating to me is that this is a really excellent example of the kind of mix of surrealistic narrative coupled with shareable, relatable, realistic depiction. So, you know, you can identify this as a human being. We can identify this as a coat. We know that these are human beings. They're very evidently human beings. They're realistic enough. We know about how tall they are. We know about how old they are. Some of the artifacts within this are very, well, not necessarily very, but they are stylized. So this is almost a surrealist tree, where it's a tree. Yes, it is a tree, but it's a tree that looks almost too perfect as a tree. You know, and this is slightly surrealist because this individual is pulling back a curtain, and the painting is of a fable within the context of a painting. You know, and so it's kind of interesting that we have this mix of realistic portrayal in kind of a contrived narrative, which is pretty much a hallmark for American realism and for a lot of realism. And here in the next section of this module, I have several different artists, and there are videos and articles of their work as well, of different people that kind of define the regionalist movement. And one thing that is, I have OCD, and one of the things that really frustrates me is most of these movements are characterized by general observations. And I really wish that the artists involved in the movements would have the consistency and self-respect to tell us that on February 11th at 7:30 in the morning in 1929 is the time that they all decided they were going to start painting regionalist movement paintings. But that's not the case. And so generally regionalism is considered to be a response to depression, and got its start about 1930, but it continues forward, and it has its roots a little bit farther back. But in general, the artists that are considered the regionalist artists are pretty consistent in their subject matter, their portrayal of their subject matter, and how they do it, consistent with their own interests in education. Like George O'Keeffe was very informed. She loved the Fauvus, and so she uses a lot of these colors to portray powerful emotion as opposed to ultra realism. In part because she lived in the American Southwest, and she said at one point, honestly, none of the people in New York had ever seen the colors that she was seeing every time she woke up. And so she would do this to kind of emphasize the freshness and vibrancy of the area that she was living in. And Grant Wood, this is a really beautiful example of American regionalism. It really kind of defines opening up into regionalism. You have this kind of narrative image. You have a very, it's called genre style image or narrative. And in this case, genre, we typically take to mean like a collection of connected narrative type ideas. But in this case, genre in art history normally means like slice of life type of thing, farm scenes, ordinary scenes. This is what realism in the 19th century really focused on, things like a ferry landing and people working in quarries. And so Grant Wood would do portraits of farmers. This is called American Gothic. All of you recognize this, and there are many things that kind of riff off of this. It's one of the most famous paintings of the regionalist movement. Doris Lee is a woman that would paint farm scenes, and if you guys took my 2720 class, at the tail end of the Renaissance, we start getting into Baroque and some other people, when we get some of these artists that would paint scenes from Northern Europe of the seasons. And that was kind of a stereotypical thing where you would show human activity at different seasons of the year. And Doris Lee is heavily influenced by these kinds of ideas. So she will portray like the slice of life in a small town America, a rural town in middle America, where she's putting a lot of actors together that that would not normally be seen at the same moment. Like the houses are a little bit out of perspective, perhaps. Some of these people are a little bit out of perspective. This person, if this horse was this size relative to this woman, that would mean that they would be about 15 feet behind her, and this guy would not be the same height as she is. And sitting on his horse, you see his figure is a little bit distorted. Other than instances like that, or these people that are, this guy's in front, this guy's behind, this guy's farther behind, they have very similar sizes that are not consistent with the perspective that's being portrayed. These kinds of surrealist touches should not detract from the idea that, these figures, they look accessible. They look realistic in the idea that we can recognize this woman, and if we saw the model, we would most likely recognize her from the painting. And each of the elements are fairly realistic, but it's less important that they're placed in a realistic environment so that it's believable, and it's more important they can recognize that there's a story here. There are several stories. This is the guy that is the farmer. This is the guy this is a stereotypical farmer with the farming hat. This is the stereotypical driver for the farmer. This is the stereotypical what's her name? Who is the wife of Odysseus?
Oh, I'm thinking Eurydice. It's not Eurydice. I was just thinking she's like the standard housewife.
Yeah, but it's I want to say, I don't want to say housefrau because that's the wrong idea. It's the capable, strong woman who keeps the house together while the man is keeping the farm together. It's that kind of idea. Here's the kid who's active, and he's playing on a horse, but he's playing on a horse because he's delivering mail. These are all
Penelope.
What's Penelope? Yes, she is the Penelope housefrau.
I'm like,
where she is the manager of the home. He's the manager of the field. So it's this idea of that there are these narratives, and people have their place. They have their value because they fulfill the place that they have. And you can tell that there are backstories, but this doesn't read as an incredibly naturalistic scene with correct perspective. But that isn't important. And here we see the same kind of thing, and this is where we get that kind of the narrative imagery that we see a lot of the times in informative museums, that are geared towards teaching 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, where this kind of perspective is not something that's going to happen in the natural world, most likely. This is more of a cinematic effect, and these people aren't entirely naturalistic, but that's not important. They are realistic enough that we can identify who these people are. We can see that they're intended to be realistic humans. We can see that these people are realistic humans. There is an event going on, and it's an event that we can relate to. There is something there that helps us to be aware of our own history and to be aware of our own identity. And these are the kinds of things that people are doing during the regionalist movement. And it happens between about mid 1920s all the way up to its heyday lasted well through the Korean War. But for the most part, American regionalism happened right during the time of the Depression. And I think it's fascinating, the different kinds of things. But can you see the links between these images? They're not of the same thing. But we do there is whether or not we can articulate what the story is, we know that there's a story going on. And we know that these are scenes that we can look out and see something very similar in the areas that we live in. This is a family finding shelter from a tornado. It is a very regional thing. This happened in Kansas. I lived through touchdown of 5 tornadoes when I was living in Alabama. These are events that everybody is very familiar with. But again, even though the figures themselves are relatable, we know who they are, we can identify them, you don't have an awful lot of academic attention paid to the perspective details. Like, this is all squashed. This would not be a scene you'd ever see in real life because the perspective is off. But that doesn't matter. We know what's going on. We see the story. And we even see this in sculpture. Anna Hyatt Huntington is one of my favorite sculptors. She would do these kinds of things. Now, arguably, she didn't follow a lot of these guidelines or a lot of these hallmarks where perspective wasn't really dead on. She was dead on. She was an incredibly accurate academic sculptor. What makes her a regionalist is the specific subject matter. She is a sculptor after the order of Remington. The highly stylized cowboy type sculptures. She did very realistic things that you would see not in New York, not in Rhode Island, but you would see in the Midwest, Middle America. You know, the natural landscape type effects. These are goats fighting, particularly mountain goats. You know, very interesting, very interesting things. Now, the next one I want to talk about is regionalism in photography. But before we go on, can you see some of those hallmarks that identify this as its own kind of movement? Again, they like some of the others that we've looked at. We have seen several movements that had manifestos, and very, you know, whenever somebody says I'm writing a manifesto, immediately you can tell two things about them. One is they take themselves very seriously, and two, they are very intent on sharing with you their own self-worth. You know, it's very highfalutin. They are manufacturing a permanent place for themselves in history. But were a couple regionalist painters that would do personal manifestos, but unlike the Cubists or the Dadaists, they didn't have an e-zine that they would share with each other. They didn't have a newsletter. Hannah Hawk would put together a help with putting together a newsletter and write to each other. Braque and Picasso wrote a semi-regular newsletter for a while, helping support people in following the movement of Cubism. Bauhaus was pretty concisely defined, but regionalism was just a lot of people responding to the art world being inaccessible to most normal people because they were intimidated by it, by creating art that everybody could relate to, in sharing these kinds of stories using figures that were relatively realistic. Ultra realism was not the important thing. Relatability was, and celebrating ordinary societal values, that ordinary folks could relate to. And it's interesting to me because we will see the same kind of thing happening as Mexico was trying to gain an identity. And what's fascinating to me is that you see this kind of regionalism surface around the world when people are in desperate need of discovering or rediscovering their identity. We see this. And one of my favorite regionalist artists is, and of course, now that I say his word, I can name, now that I talk about his work, I can't say his name. He operates out of Nigeria and London. Oh, and he does absolutely beautiful work. Oh, but he's a contemporary sculptor. And I'm going to spend a minute. I'm
looking to see if I can find it.
Oh, Yinke Shonibara. Yinke Shonibara he is a contemporary sculptor who's also a regionalist. And what's interesting about this guy is most people are not going to consider that when you see his work. But let me show you what makes his work regionalist. Another guy I really like is El Anatsui, who's out of Ghana. Very contemporary, but he's also regionalist. Both these guys are emerging from environments, post-colonial Africa. People are still recovering. This is the third generation for some of these countries after colonialism. And a couple other countries, like France, pulled out of their last African colony only 2 years ago, believe it or not. But the colonial system throughout Africa was such that each region had their own gauge of railroad tracks. So you couldn't transport goods from, for example, Ethiopia to Ghana, because you would have to go, you would have to change the goods from train to train at least a dozen times just to get from one side of the continent to the other. The thing that made America so powerful economically in the 19th century was the fact that you could load a train in New York, and in 3 weeks, those goods would be in Los Angeles. Period. I mean, no problem at all. And that's one of the reasons why America became an economic powerhouse. But let me show you some of Yinka's work. And this is a little bit outside of what we're looking at, but I want you to be familiar with the idea that regionalism, there are common threads to regionalism wherever it is. Now, these are not paintings. These are sculptures. But look at these works. When we're talking about emergence of colonialism, what we're talking about is people trying to reestablish their identity after their world has been shaken apart. This is what happened with American regionalism. The economy was crushed. People had to reestablish their identity. This is what Yinka Shonibara is doing. He's taking two kids, they're dancing what appears to be a relatively European-style dance. But what do you notice about their dress, their clothing? These are very much contemporary Western African style fabric designs. And then you see the faces. These are very much out of that the Museum of Ethnography that Picasso went to. These are what we call African style masks, specifically from the Yoruba and Ife kingdom areas. And I just think that this is fascinating. But do you see how this relates to regionalism? These kinds of things? Can you identify like just two of the things that relate it to regionalism? There's a story going on. It's realistic enough. You can identify these as kids playing, and you can relate to them. I mean, there are stories going on that are both Western, European, as well as very African. And I use that term loosely. I'm specifically talking about 7 or 8 countries that are right around Ghana, Nigeria, that part of Western Africa. But you can kind of see what's going on there, I think. And I think that this is a valid argument that he is, even though he's a very contemporary sculptor, he's also a regionalist, because we're dealing with those same kind of stories revolving around narratives that help us to establish identity. And that's the thing that's exciting to me, because we can look at some of these different art movements and identify them very much as art movements from a specific time or place, but we can really connect with them as well as regionalist art movements, because they're helping people to be proud of who they are, to generate an identity. It is approachable for most human beings because you can recognize yourself in them. One of the things I love about Yinka Shonibara's dancing kids is that among my children, my youngest daughter she was born in Zimbabwe, and my oldest was born in Provo, Utah. And you can see them; they can both see themselves very much in Yinka Shonibara's work. They can both find their identity there, and I think that is really beautiful. There is something wonderful about an artist that can create work that is satisfying to their target audience, and then satisfying and rejuvenating to everybody else as well. This says a lot. And I think the next group of regionalist artists we're going to look at, this was all started by their careers really were established through the FSA, the Farm Service Administration, which was one of the New Deal projects that was established by President Roosevelt. Now, you know that the American Depression was bad. When it was so bad, the U.S. had to justify getting into World War II in order to come out of the Depression. I think that everybody had a responsibility to save the world from Nazism, but that was sadly, that was the principal justification that took Congress to approve our coming into World War II, was because it would help us get out of the Depression, which I think is really interesting. So no more about that. But this is arguably one of the most famous historical photos in the United States. And this is Dorothea Lange's migrant mother from the Farm Services Administration. Notice the time period. This is right in the thick of American regionalism. Now, how can we identify this as a regionalist art image? Well, it is a genre depiction. It is a narrative of ordinary everyday life. This could very much be a painting that was done in 19th century realism, and it could have been done as a painting by any of the American painters we looked at just a moment ago that were also regionalist painters. Dorothea Lange's brush was her camera. And when the Farm Services Administration, when they started doing their job, President Roosevelt talked to Roy Stryker, Dr. Stryker, who's an economics professor. And what he asked him to do was, President Roosevelt said, Congress is so stuck on their own perspective. They have been living away from their constituents sometimes for generations, and they have no idea the hardships of people around the world. All they can see is their relationship with their current lobbyists. And what President Roosevelt wanted was for Professor Stryker to document American life, both in a way that future generations could see what was going on at present, but also to give a very personal perspective to what is going on economically throughout the country for the representatives and senators that were in Washington, D.C. And what I really appreciate about Professor Stryker is that he took his job very seriously. And these are the three rules that everybody had to follow from the artist that he selected for the project. Everything that documented had to be a real event. None of the photographers could stage anything. They had to talk to people that were living in their car. If they were going to photograph a family living in a tent, they had to photograph the family living in their tent. They couldn't stage it. If they were going to photograph a child crying, the child had to already be crying. They couldn't stage it. This is important. I don't know if you've ever stayed up late at night watching ads for UNICEF or any of that kind of stuff. Remember a documentary about some of these Save the Crying Children things, where the photographer would say, oh yeah, if the kid wasn't crying, we'd pinch him to make him cry. And Professor Stryker said, it has to be a real situation. So it must be a real event. It cannot be staged or dramatized by the artist. And the people could not be coached, costumed, or made up by the artist. No makeup or anything. Now, and Dorothea Lange, this is a good model for what was going on. What she would do, still up until this stage, let me backtrack just a minute. Do you know why Americans were and Europeans were so serious when they were photographed in the 19th century, early 20th century? A lot of people say because they had to stay still for 2 minutes. Well, no, you can hold a smile for 2 minutes. You can hold a smile for half an hour. I've seen that at many wedding receptions. Okay. The difference is in America and Europe, the photographic portraiture represented the same kind of thing as a dramatic portrait done by a European painter. And that was always a solemn occasion. So people would try to look solemn and serious because this was an immortalization of who they were. And that's what they thought was appropriate. Dorothea and many of these other photographers noticed that if they set up their camera, people started holding themselves in different situations, in different postures, because they would see, oh, this is going to be immortal. And so what a lot of these artists would do is they would start talking to the group of people. If there were 100 people walking in a line, they would talk to the people in the line. They would make sure that the people knew that they were there to document a situation, not to immortalize them. Mm-hmm. And they would make the people comfortable. So Dorothea talked to the immigrant mother for about a half an hour beforehand, because this woman was really uncomfortable with the idea of getting photographed. And then Dorothea sat up there and she would just sit there and be totally quiet. And sometimes for an hour, hour and a half, until everybody was ignoring her. And then she would take the photo.
Mm.
And so you get, as much as is possible, an honest portrayal of an event.
Do you
And
know? Oh, sorry. Do
I
you
was
know
just,
about Dorothea and Ansel Adams coming out to Tokerville and Gunlock and St. George?
I don't know an awful lot about those specifics, um, other than Dorothea. The Boulder homes out by
Yeah.
where are they? Oh, Kanab.
Well,
That
yeah.
yeah, she went through there. She photographed. She did a lot of stuff like that, following the same kind of process.
So she and Ansel Adams did a study called Three Mormon Towns or Three Mormon Cities, I believe. And they came to Tokerville and Gunlock and St. George, and they documented the everyday life, the slice of life, like you're saying. And if you look it up, you can see a ton of pictures. I've probably spent 3 or 4 hours just looking at the Tokerville pictures because they're so fascinating because I live here in Tokerville. But like you can absolutely, like, a lot of times people will say, well, photography is not exactly, a visual art because it's a replication, and I don't agree with that. I
Well,
think if
I have to
anybody,
react to that pretty strongly. Um, Art can be found in every genre and media,
Mhm.
and photographers, for the most part, the difference between them and painters is they're doing the same thing with both hands tied behind their backs.
Mm.
They don't have the availability of malleable paint and a paintbrush. All they're stuck with is the lighting that they're given, and the only control they have is formatting. So photography is very much art. So sorry for
And
interrupting.
then, well, no, I agree with you. I think, and if you look at their series, the final pictures and the captions, they ended up in Time Life magazine for a while, but to be able to tell such a narrative with a simple moment captured in a photograph is just it actually feels like, when I think of regionalism, that's what I think about. How can I see the
Yeah,
most authentic moment of a person in that place and get the full story from a glimpse? And
yeah.
yeah, I'm
I,
obsessed
I
with
think
Dorothea
that's
Lange.
really really good. And um, everyone, we go out to eat maybe once every two months, something like that. And we'd like to go. We'll go to George's restaurant in St.
Mhm.
George here every once in a while, just because my wife loves seeing the regionalist photos
Yeah,
that are done that are on display there. That's where we found out that at one point the St. George Airport trained about a quarter of the pilots in World War II.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, and they
nobody
were,
knows about that.
I mean, the people sitting on the hill watching the atomic bomb tests, they were sitting on benches. Those photos that the university, or it was University of Utah or BYU, they started a whole catalog of just watching these people in their Sunday best sitting on benches on top of a mesa with a big atomic cloud in the background. And you're like, wait, what? It's, I, yeah, regionalism. This is my, like, I think I'm an artist of many mediums, but theater was always my first love. And the art of storytelling in Dorothea Lange's work is just, it's otherworld. It's just profound.
What is so exciting to me about Professor Stryker is that you would expect, I mean, this is a period of US history, like many, that is very misogynistic,
Yeah.
very much so. And, a lot of people don't know, but Louis Tiffany was ostracized from New York society because he was one of the few people that didn't fire all his women workers after the Spanish American War and all the men came
Right.
back. He said, well, no, they're doing a good job and they know what they're doing. I'm not going to get rid of them and train newbies.
Mhm.
And he was ostracized for not firing the women,
Mhm.
which I think is just absurd. But what is fascinating to me about Professor Stryker is that out of the 24 photographers that he selected 2 or 3 Black Americans. He's selected, I believe, 5 or 6 women
Mhm.
that became world famous journalism photographers. There's even a movie about one of them, a lady that went over to uh, World War II Germany and
Mm.
started documenting what was going on with the Nazi war criminals.
Mm.
I can't remember her name, but that movie came out. I think Kate Blanchett played her or something like that, and that came out like a year or so ago.
Hmm.
Um, but this is he was very open-minded, and he felt very strongly that if this was going to be a slice of American life, it had to be a slice of every American's life.
Mm.
And so, hats off to William Stryker. But this is one of the websites I want people to look at. I just think I want to show some of these images, and they're award-winning images because they deserve to be.
Mhm.
And it just you look at these things, they're just beautiful depictions, but they are very much examples of regionalism. And so, go through and look at these. There are some really amazing. Arthur Rothstein is incredible, of course. Dorothea, and then and we look at some of these, and then there's some guys that people don't really know an awful lot about.
Mhm.
Gordon Parks is an individual who this is his version of American Gothic. But what he did is open up the door so that representatives in Washington, D.C. and senators started realizing that Black America had a role at the table.
Mm.
And this is really, you're seeing the emergence of what later became civil rights
Mm.
because of his photography. I mean, you'll look at how dignified and stately these people were when outside of the Harlem Renaissance and outside of Gordon Parks and the FSA, depictions of Black Americans were cartoons.
Mhm.
Like the very first Steamboat Willie, very first Walt Disney cartoon was a caricature of a Black American clown. You know, pretty awful. But it's I say pretty awful. I can speak to that from our today's perspective. I think it's really unfair to judge any historical movement beyond its context. I think that's a bad idea. Um, but anyway, you look at what Gordon Parks did is really open up the door to what later became the civil rights movement.
Mm.
I think the Harlem Renaissance and him absolutely powerful. And then I'm emerging back, I'm circling around back to the thing that I mentioned just a little bit ago with Yinka Shonibara. Regionalism is not only American.
Right.
And we are going to look at some other aspects of Mexican regionalism, specifically Mexican muralism.
Mm.
Um, I I have a friend that lives in Canada, and I told him I was going to send him an image of Canada as the 51st state, and he's going to send me a T-shirt that shows the lower 48 as Canada's 11th province. But but we look at this from pretty much the moment of the dawn of the age of discovery.
Mm.
People in Mexico have been considered as subhuman by their colonizers. And there were absolutely horrible things that happened with the Spanish governors and everything like in Mexico, just absolutely terrible. Get a glimpse of that, just watch any of the Zorro movies, and it kind of gives you a feel, whether or not that's historically accurate is aside the point, but the societal field that Zorro emerged into is a pretty good depiction of how ordinary Mexicans felt about the world that they lived in. I mean, the fiction oftentimes is a safe space to reflect how we see the world around us. Pretty brutal things, but you can see the same kind of stuff going on. These are identifiable figures. They're realistic enough that we know who they are, but it's surreal enough to the point where everybody can approach it too. This is a story. It's not. It tells a narrative. A guy working himself to the bone because he loves his family. His wife doing everything he can to support him, everything she can to support him. This is the ideal of the family, and it is told in that American regionalist style. I'm going to say American regionalism. This is American regionalism. Mexico is part of America. It's Central America. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. Diego Rivera is one icon of this. Frida Kahlo is another. And he dealt with individuals and their relationship to society, their identity within society. And she dealt specifically with women finding identity.
She also dealt with him.
Oh, yeah, she also dealt with him. I believe they were married twice.
They were.
And then we get Edward Hopper. They say, this is not from the Midwest, and necessarily. He's generally did the same kind of things. He had these genre scenes, but he was not dealing with Middle America. He was dealing with people that lived in urban settings. But he's also very much a regionalist, and you can see that because, again, this is a narrative scene, something you'd see every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it is done realistic enough that you can identify who the people are. You can identify where things are. You can tell what kind of place this is. It's midnight at an all-night diner, in an urban setting. And then, of course, one of my favorite regionalists is Norman Rockwell. And a lot of people dismiss him as, quote unquote, just an illustrator.
Ooh.
But what's fascinating about Norman Rockwell is he tackled subjects that if Norman Rockwell was not born into a white family and did not support himself with his own artwork and had not established connections with the New Yorker and all these other magazines, he would have been castigated and destroyed.
Well, yeah, he was also a propagandist, in a sense.
Well, he did do propaganda earlier on, and he also did propaganda to support Kennedy's work with civil rights.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is he did things where he addressed the reality of the effects of Jim Crow laws.
Yep.
And desegregation of schools, that if any other artist had tried, they would have been destroyed.
Yeah.
But because everybody loved Norman Rockwell, nobody touched him. And what's people think of him as only this, this realist, this American regionalist. You look at this spatter painting. What was fascinating is he was constantly afraid that nobody would take him seriously. And when he found out that there was another show in New York about people trying to do postmodernist work, he did a spatter painting in the style of Jackson Pollock, sent it in and got first place. But he had sent
Did
it
he
in.
really?
Yeah.
I didn't
And
know
so under his pseudonym, he was an award-winning postmodernist painter. And people don't realize that. He really knew his stuff.
Well, everybody thinks of him as the Thanksgiving table. And in my family, we make a joke that there's nothing realistic about that family Thanksgiving dinner that he painted. Because most of those
happy kids and everything.
Yeah, it's where's the wine? Where are the tears? Where's the blood? But
yeah, where are the people wanting to kill each other because somebody made a dumb mistake of talking about religion or politics?
Right. But
yeah.
I mean, no, if you actually go further into his work, it's shocking. It's evocative. It's, I don't know, it's taboo. It's avant. It's yeah, he stretched some boundaries.
Well, I believe next week or the week after, we're going to circle around and look at regionalism in Mexico. the problem with regionalism is we can look at it. Every country on the planet has regionalism, Soviet regionalism, you know, just all this kind of stuff. And there are icon, and we're just going to look at a little bit. But yeah, but you get artists like Norman Rockwell that I'm going to say very few people in the legitimate, you know, white collar art world took seriously, but he was absolutely brilliant. And
Well,
he
and I think
used the
people,
language,
oh,
he
sorry.
used the language of realistic American regionalism to tackle subjects that were very difficult to speak about. And he did a lot of work like that. Yeah, he did do a lot of propaganda work as well. And he did a lot of monumental work. And he did a lot of stuff that he considered thoughtless illustration.
Mhm.
But what is so amazing about him is you look at his anatomical studies, and they're right up there with like Bern Hogarth.
Right.
You look at his social impact work, and I mean, he did stuff that was as difficult for him in his time as what Judy Chicago did 10 years later. You
Yeah.
know, and it's funny to me that we can look at these artists and we can discount them as one or another, or dismiss them, or decide that they only fit into one genre, one type of art, or one movement. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of these artists that we're looking at are like ZZ Top, who, yeah, they are icons of rock, but they also do really beautiful, delicate mandolin concerts. You know, it's just, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, you know, R. Crumb, who does the same thing. He was underground comics and an icon of punk comics and an icon of punk art. And he is one of the most revered um, uh, non-electric instrumentalists in France. You know, what?
I think this brings it though back to the beginning. Okay, you ready for this? The very beginning of our conversation about the rich and the middle class, right? A lot of times I hear people talk about regionalism. The fact that it's stylized, it feels to them like it's not high art. It's not, it becomes closer to craft, which people tend to discount. And I'm like, well, no, I have a very strong reaction to that, because it by stylizing it, like you said, by giving it, I call the stylized stuff, I call it the salt. It's what gives it its flavor. You have the true thing, the chicken, and then you have the salt. And it that stylized makes it accessible to the people that wouldn't normally be with the highbrow art. And I think in itself that
It
makes it
almost
higher.
it provides an atmosphere where it allows you to appreciate it when otherwise you feel that the other stuff is outside of your reach. It becomes
Yeah,
approachable. It communicates with the audience,
yeah,
and which is what art should be doing.
sure.
And the reality is, at the end of the Industrial Revolution, you do start generating an atmosphere in the art market world where people started producing art specifically as investment properties.
Hmm.
And you really see that take off right before World War One, and then really explode um, until by the time you get right at the end of the Korean War, you get to this point where people that have enough money to pay for someone else to send their son to war instead are the ones that are looking at art as investment and not enjoyment. And you get the people like Bauhaus and the regionalists, oddly, that want art to be accessible to everybody. And that's why you
Yeah.
get De Stijl and Bauhaus going to universal geometry, because they want everybody to find relatability with the art. And you get the regionalists doing things that are slightly stylized, slightly simpler than full European style realism, because they want people to feel like they can give themselves permission to access it. And I think that's, and I was going to make a comment about craft and art. Um, Today, craft is essentially considered to be anything that you do pseudo creative that you do as a result of following directions. And what I think is so sad is that the distinction between craft and art did not emerge anywhere in the world until at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution,
Right.
specifically as a result of people mass producing artwork for consumption by the middle income masses,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is really, this is where you start seeing in the West the high published numbers of like lithographs and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that, poster art, things like that, where in Japan it had already been going on.
Right.
You get the
With the wood
woodblock,
blocks, yeah.
Hokusai and others producing the woodblock prints that people like William Morris and Van Gogh just fell in love with.
Yeah.
And that informed how they did their art. But
Mary
anyway,
Cassatt, yeah.
those are conversations for other times. But I hope people can appreciate that regionalism is a perspective. It's all about claiming identity, supporting self-worth, reclaiming self-worth, finding identity after the crisis, after crises like colonization or economic hardship, or just you get during the Dust Bowl and other times you get a huge with many people losing their farms, losing family lands in the East, and having to move to California or to Nevada or to Utah just for their families to survive. You get a real uprooting and loss of personal identity. And regionalism, regardless of where it happens in the world, helps people to reclaim identity, I think. Today, we're seeing regionalism in post-colonial Southeast Asia. We're seeing regionalism in central China. We're seeing regionalism in Mongolia. We're seeing regionalism in most of the countries in Africa, because people are at a point where they can, beyond violent means, outside of violent means, feel that it's okay to start reestablishing or reasserting or rebuilding or creating their own identity. And I think that's really beautiful. Anyway, any questions or last observations before we wrap tonight up?
I just hope that the class enjoyed your and I's conversation this evening. Feel free to join us next week.
Yeah, please don't feel obligated, just feel guilty. But thank you very much. I hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful week and weekend, and I look forward to seeing more people, seeing Kelly and others next week.
All right. Have a great night, man.
Thank you. You too.
Take care.
All right, we'll see you.